There are stories that echo through crowded streets, and then there are stories that hide in the silence between heartbeats. Welcome to Whispers of Asia. Here, we don't shout to frighten you. We whisper softly, patiently, until the fear finds its way under your skin. Tonight's tale comes from the shadowed temples and forgotten jungles of northern Thailand, a place where spirits are not feared but invited, where a bell, long sealed in silence, rings once more, not for the living, but for those who died without a name. This is a story of rituals lost, prayers reversed, and a soul chosen to finish what the monks could not. So turn down the lights and listen closely, because when the bell rings at 3:33 a.m., it's already too late to run. The first time Sawalak heard the bell, it was 3:33 a.m. She sat upright in bed, drenched in the humid darkness of her rented home, heart pounding as if summoned. The sound didn't echo like any bell she had known. It didn't toll with ceremony or declare the hour with pride. It creaked, groaned, as if dragged into existence from beneath the soil. Not loud, not bold, just wrong. It came from deep within the forest that bordered the edge of the village, a place the locals never spoke of, not even in whispers. The bell rang 3 times, low and heavy. Then silence returned, thick and suffocating. She thought she had dreamed it, but the air told her otherwise. It vibrated in her teeth, settled behind her eyes, left her skin chilled despite the tropical heat. Sawalak wrapped her shawl around her shoulders and approached the window. Outside, the village of Ban Sang lay wrapped in shadow. Not a dog stirred, not a rooster crowed. The jungle, usually a chorus of insects and frogs, had fallen completely mute. Even the wind seemed to hold its breath. She didn't know yet that the bell should not have rung, because the temple it belonged to had been sealed for over 50 years. Sawalak was not the kind of woman who ran from whispers. She had come to this village precisely because it didn't speak too loudly. After the collapse of her marriage, the scandal at her last school, and the silent shame that seemed to follow her through every alley of Chiang Mai, she needed somewhere quiet to begin again. She applied for the government teaching post with much hope and was surprised to be accepted. Ban Non Sang was small, 2 dirt roads, 1 wooden schoolhouse, and a village head who greeted her with a polite smile and little else. Her rented home sat at the far end of the main road, its back porch just meters from the edge of the forest. The villagers called it the Old House, not because it was ancient, but because no one had dared live in it for years. "It's too close," the woman who handed her the keys muttered. When she asked, "Too close to what?" she just shook her head and looked away. On her first day of teaching, the children were bright, curious, and unusually quiet. They asked few questions, always checked the clock, and left exactly before sunset. By the time Sawalak locked the school door, the village felt like a ghost town. Her neighbors were kind but distant. Offerings appeared on her doorstep every few mornings, banana leaves folded into intricate shapes, bowls of rice, a faint trace of incense. When she asked who left them, everyone shrugged. One evening, she asked the village elder, Pra Narin, about the bell. They were sitting outside the tiny tea shack, watching the sun dip behind the tree line. "There's an old temple," she said casually, "in the forest, isn't there?" Pra Narin's face froze. Then he looked away and took a long sip of his tea. "We don't speak of it," he murmured. That place is forgotten. But I heard a bell last night. He set his cup down. His hands trembled just slightly. You must have dreamed it. I don't think so. He looked at her then, really looked at her. If you value your peace, teacher, he said, voice low and grave, never follow a bell that no one else hears. But the dreams had already begun. That night, Sawalak found herself wandering through mist-choked forest paths. She followed the faint sound of chanting, deep, rhythmic male voices. The jungle around her was damp and alive. Insects buzzed, trees leaned toward her like silent witnesses. Then the forest gave way to a clearing, and at its center stood a structure that looked half devoured by time. A temple, not majestic, not royal, just waiting. She stepped inside. The air was thick with the scent of burnt incense and something fouler, iron and rot. Statues lined the walls, broken-limbed Buddhas, guardian spirits with hollow eyes, and a lone image of a monk with no face. At the front of the hall stood a bell, suspended by rotting ropes, its bronze surface dark with age. As she approached, the chanting grew louder. Then it stopped, and the bell rang once. She awoke choking, her bedsheets tangled around her, her throat raw from whispering a prayer she didn't recognize. The next day she asked a group of students about the forest. Their eyes widened. One little boy dropped his pencil. "Do not go there," a whispered girl said, clutching her amulet necklace. "It's just a temple, isn't it?" "No," the boy said flatly. "It's a mouth. The monks are still there, but they don't have bodies anymore." That night, the bell rang again. 3 slow chimes, each one dragging longer than the last. This time, she stepped outside. The forest loomed like a wall. Mist curled at its base like smoke from something deep beneath the earth. And though every rational part of her said to turn back, she found herself walking forward, barefoot, drawn not by curiosity, but by something heavier, like a forgotten memory returning to claim its shape. She only took a few steps before a woman's voice called out, "Teacher!" Sawalak turned. It was Duan, the herbalist who lived 3 houses down. Her face was pale, her hands shaking. "You must not go in. Even the trees don't forgive what happened there." Sawalak stood frozen, feeling the pressure of the bell still vibrating in her chest. Duan stepped closer. "Do you know why the bell rings at that hour?" "No. It's the time between death and forgetting, when the soul hasn't crossed, but the world has already moved on." Later that night, Sawalak dreamed again. This time, she stood inside the temple, surrounded by monks in crimson robes. They didn't chant, they wept, silently, their eyes sewn shut with red thread. One held out a bowl to her. She looked inside. It was filled with teeth, and beneath the teeth, ash shaped like a human face. When she tried to run, her feet would not move. Her voice would not rise. And then the bell rang, again, and again, and again, each toll unraveling the world around her into ash and bone. She awoke screaming. The next morning, Sawalak found ash on her front steps. It formed a ring, neat, deliberate, unnatural. She swept it away, but her hands shook the whole time. She checked her door locks, all untouched. She walked to the back porch. The forest stood unmoved, but now, if she listened closely, she could hear the faintest hum, like a bowl being rung in the distance, too low for the ear, but too deep for the mind to ignore. Her heart beat out of rhythm all day. By the time night returned, she had already made her mind up. She would go to the temple, not because she wanted to, but because something in her bones told her she already had. She didn't remember much from her childhood, but flashes had begun to surface. Her grandmother's voice warning her never to speak to shadows, a story about the long-forgotten dead, and an old prayer said backwards before funerals. That night, the bell rang again, and this time, Sawalak was already dressed, a flashlight in her hand, her feet stepping softly into the earth. The forest did not resist her. No bramble scratched her skin, no root tangled her steps. It welcomed her, and deep within it, past the tangled trees and the veil of mist, the bell waited, not to warn her, but to remember her. The path into the forest was barely a path at all. It was more suggestion than trail, overgrown and smothered by years of silence. Vines clung to Sawalek's legs like fingers begging her not to go. The air hung thick with the scent of wet bark and something older, the faint aroma of burnt incense long since extinguished. Even the moon seemed hesitant to follow her past the first row of trees. She walked in silence, guided by the memory of her dreams more than any real direction. The bell hadn't rung since she stepped into the forest, as if it knew she was coming, as if it no longer needed to call. The deeper she went, the colder the air became. Not cold in the usual sense, but spiritually cold, the kind that crept through her bones and whispered doubts directly into her bloodstream. Her flashlight flickered, but did not die. Shadows moved, even when she did not. Every tree seemed older here, gnarled, twisted, hunched like monks mid-bough. They watched her. She felt it. But no bird stirred, no insect sang. The forest had entered a kind of reverent silence. And then she saw it. Through the curtain of hanging banyan roots, the temple emerged. It wasn't grand, it wasn't golden or glistening. It was sinking, half consumed by the jungle, as if the forest itself was trying to erase it. Moss blanketed its walls, and the carvings along its outer rim had softened into vague, ghostly impressions. A staircase of cracked stone led to a set of wooden doors, rotted and caked with years of mud. She stepped forward. As she climbed the stairs, she noticed something embedded in the moss between the stones, a fragment of bone. Small, human. She froze. More bones littered the steps, tiny phalanges, shards of skull, blackened teeth. Not arranged, just there, as if the temple had exhaled them. A single lotus flower, browned and decayed, lay atop the final step. She reached the doors and touched them. They opened without effort. Inside it was dark, unnaturally so. Her flashlight barely pierced the gloom, its beam falling on cracked tiles and dust-coated statues. The air was heavy, not musty, heavy, like something spiritual weighed it down, like time had pooled here and never left. The main hall stretched ahead. On each side stood rows of statues, not of Buddha, but of monks, each carved in the act of prostration, their hands pressed together in eternal prayer. But their eyes were hollowed out, as if something had gouged them open from the inside. She walked slowly, her steps echoing with a sound she couldn't place, like dripping water or sobbing far in the distance. At the end of the hall stood the bell. Suspended on fraying ropes between two blackened wooden posts, the bell was far larger than she had imagined. Its bronze surface was green with corrosion, but traces of ancient carvings remained. Swirls of flame, lotus petals, and what looked like the faces of crying children. Beneath the bell lay a small altar, half collapsed, upon which sat a single offering bowl, cracked clean down the middle, and smeared across the bell's edge, dull but unmistakable, was a dark, rust-red stain. Blood. Her mouth went dry. She stepped forward, drawn to it. Her flashlight flickered again. The silence was so complete that she could hear her own heartbeat pounding behind her eyes. She reached out and touched the bell. It was warm. She gasped and stepped back. That was when she saw the wall behind the altar. Dozens of names carved into the wood, but they weren't names as she knew them. They were partial, fragmented, letters scratched backward or upside down, words repeated over and over. Some were crossed out, some bled into others, but all seemed to want to be remembered, desperately, angrily. And at the very bottom, carved deeper than the rest, was one word that made her spine lock. Sawalek. She stepped back, trembling. That was impossible. She had never been here before, never heard of this place until a few nights ago, and yet her name was here. Something moved behind her. She spun around, flashlight raised, but saw nothing. And then she heard it, a whisper, not from her ears, but from inside her own mind. "You've come back." She ran, fumbling through the dark, bumping into statues, her breath tearing in her throat. The forest temple didn't try to stop her, but it didn't let her go easily either. The silence clung to her, the bell stayed behind, unstruck, but she could feel its resonance inside her chest like an echo she couldn't shake. When she finally burst out of the tree line and onto the main road, dawn was just beginning to break. The village still slept, but the ash had returned to her doorstep, this time in the shape of a lotus. Sawalek didn't go to school that day. She sat in her house, every window shuttered, clutching her grandmother's old amulet and trying to remember what she had forgotten. Because she had forgotten something, she knew it now. The way the temple had felt familiar, the way the names on the wall blurred into her own handwriting, the warmth of the bell, the strange dreams that didn't feel like dreams at all. She wasn't just a stranger here. She was a key. But to what? She still didn't know. That night, she lit a single candle and placed it beside her bed. She whispered a prayer, not the kind she had learned in temples, but one she barely remembered, one her grandmother had made her repeat before funerals, before river cremations, a prayer she thought was just a superstition. May the forgotten know I still carry them. May the silenced remember my voice. May the bell ring only for truth. When she finished, the candle flickered and then extinguished itself. Outside, the bell rang once. No wind, no storm, just a single, deliberate toll. And in her dreams, the monks began to chant again. But this time, they were not weeping. They were waiting. The morning air was sharp with the scent of rain, though no clouds touched the sky. Sawalek hadn't slept, not truly. Her dreams had become indistinguishable from waking life, stitched together with chanting and smoke. She found herself pacing the floor of her small home, the echo of that solitary bell still resonating in her spine. She needed answers, not from the villagers, not from the forest, but from someone older. The only person who didn't look away when she spoke of the temple was Luang Pi Kamon, a retired monk who lived alone in a wooden hut near the edge of the rice paddies. They called him the Silent One because he had taken a vow never to speak of the temple since the day he left it. A vow, the villagers whispered, not out of piety, but fear. She found him sitting on a straw mat in his doorway, palms pressed together, eyes closed. His face was carved by time and solitude, deep wrinkles branching from his eyes like tributaries of forgotten rivers. She bowed deeply and sat before him, waiting. Minutes passed before he opened his eyes. "You've heard the bell," he said, voice like rusted bamboo. Saulawak shivered. "Yes." He nodded once. "And you've gone into the forest?" "I had to." "No one has to," he whispered, "but some are called." She hesitated, then took something from her bag. Wrapped in a silk cloth was a brittle scroll she had found near the altar, tucked between two collapsed wooden beams behind the bell. It had been buried beneath dust and dried leaves, nearly invisible. She hadn't dared open it until now. She handed it to him. Kamon unwrapped it with slow, reverent hands. The parchment was thin, water-stained, and smelled of old candle wax. The writing was in Pali, but it was wrong. The script was mirrored, the lines reversed, written to be read in reflection. As he scanned it, his breath caught. He looked up at her, eyes wide. This is not a prayer," he said. "It is an invitation." He told her of a ritual once practiced only by forest monks, Huan Tien Long Ruang, the long light of the forgotten. It was a rite never meant for public temples. It was created for those who died without names, whose bodies were never claimed, whose souls were lost in the dark, those who had no merit to carry them forward into the next life. The ritual was dangerous because it sought to offer merit where there was none, to pull the forgotten souls from the shadows and return them to memory, but only through a vessel. The soul giver, one living person, one open heart. The ritual required the soul giver to chant the names of the dead, names the living no longer remembered, to chant them backwards as a way to trick the gates of forgetting. The scroll she held was the chant. It had been used once, long ago, in that very temple. But the ritual was never completed. "Why?" Saulawak asked. "Because no one was willing to be the soul giver, and the monks were too afraid to continue. They tried to silence the bell, to bury the names, to seal the temple. But the ritual had already begun, and the forgotten do not forgive being called and left unanswered." Saulawak stared at the scroll in her lap. The script pulsed. The ink had not faded. It felt alive. "How did you get out?" she asked. Kamon didn't answer right away. His gaze drifted to the horizon, where the paddies met the trees. "I didn't," he said finally. She frowned. "My body walked out, but a part of me stayed. I still hear them, every night, the names, the begging, the hunger. I keep my silence so I do not say their names aloud. That's how they enter, through remembrance, through attention." He looked at her, suddenly stern. "Burn that scroll." "I can't," she whispered. "It found me." That night, the dreams returned with greater force. She stood again inside the temple, only this time it was whole, newly built, gleaming with gold. Monks knelt in rows, their chants reverberating like thunder. She stood at the front, holding the scroll in her hands, reading the names backwards. One by one, candles lit themselves before her, flames dancing like spirits returning home. But with each name, A shadow rose behind her, not leaving, but entering. And when she turned to face the monks, their faces had become hers. Saulawak awoke with blood on her hands. Not a dream, real. Thin cuts lined her palms as if scratched by paper edges, yet the scroll lay untouched on her desk. The bell rang again, but this time it didn't stop. It tolled again and again, low and mournful, as if something buried was rising step by step. She clutched her ears, but the sound came from within her head, not outside. The scroll on the desk pulsed, its corners curling, its ink shimmering as if wet. She felt herself being pulled, not by feet, but by memory, a memory that wasn't hers, yet lived within her. The name, carved in the temple wall, Saulawak. She returned to Kamon the next day with her voice ragged. What do they want? He stared at her with infinite sadness. To be remembered, to finish what was started. But not all of them want peace. Some have learned to live in anger. Some remember only suffering. And some want to become flesh again. You think I'm the soul giver? You are. Or you are close enough. The ritual recognizes your blood. My blood! Do you know who your grandmother was? She was a healer. She raised you. She was the sister of the last monk who attempted the ritual, the one who ran when the bell began to scream. You are his penance, his echo. Saulawak left the hut with her heart crumbling. This was no longer a haunting. This was a debt, and she was the payment. The scroll would not burn. She tried that night, but the flame only licked its edges before dying, as if some unseen breath blew it out. She tried to bury it, but the earth rejected it. She tried to drown it, but it surfaced hours later on her doorstep, dry. And the bell never stopped. Not truly. Even when it wasn't ringing, its silence felt like it was holding its breath, waiting, watching, remembering. On the third night, Saulawak dreamed again, only this time she was no longer an observer. She stood on the altar, draped in robes she did not own, holding a bowl of ash and bone. The monks around her chanted the backwards names, and she repeated them without thought. Each name summoned a flicker of a face: child, man, mother, soldier. Some wept, some smiled, some screamed. And as the last name was spoken, the bell shattered with sound, and from it crawled something enormous and faceless, stitched from the limbs of the forgotten, made of prayer and silence and teeth. It reached for her, and she did not run. She opened her arms. The village began to change, not loudly, not all at once, but in the quiet, subtle ways that only someone paying attention would notice. And Saulawak was always paying attention now. It began with names. She greeted her neighbor one morning, an old woman named Maidwan, who always smiled and handed her lemongrass for tea. But today, the woman blinked at her, puzzled. "What did you call me?" "Maidwan," Saulawak said. The woman frowned, shaking her head. "No, that's not my name. What do you mean? That's what you've always—" The woman stepped back, eyes dull. I don't remember. Please don't say it again." She turned and walked away, leaving behind a strange silence, as though her identity had slipped loose from her shoulders and fallen into the dust. That night, Sawalak found teeth on her pillow. Not large, not adult. Small, baby teeth, arranged in a perfect circle. Her hands trembled as she swept them into a bowl, wrapped them in cloth, and buried them behind the house. She whispered prayers she didn't know she knew. The forest hummed. The bell did not ring, but the silence it left in its place was worse, like a held breath, like a child waiting to be found in the dark. The next day, 3 students failed to show up to class. No word, no excuse. When she asked their parents, they said, "What children?" Sawalak felt something hollow open up in her chest. She pulled out the school roster and found blank spaces where their names had once been. The ink had faded, as if time had erased them. And when she closed her eyes, she saw them, the children, standing at the edge of the forest, faces turned to her, mouths open in silent screams. It grew worse from there. Ash began to appear every morning at her door, never scattered, always shaped. One day it formed the outline of a hand, the next a broken circle, then a series of lines, polyscript, reversed. She began recording them in a notebook, drawing the symbols, trying to piece together the language of the dead. She didn't tell anyone. She couldn't. Not because she feared being dismissed, but because part of her understood now. The bell wasn't just calling, it was remembering, and each symbol was a name trying to be reborn through her. At night, she began to speak in her sleep. She only knew because she awoke one evening to the sound of her own voice, low, rhythmic, chanting something she didn't recognize. She recorded it on her phone. When she played it back, it was a list of names, none that she remembered, but when she whispered them aloud, her house creaked. Not with wind, with presence. Something unseen shifted in the corners of her vision, a shadow behind a cupboard, a wet footprint that vanished when she blinked. She heard breathing under the floorboards, soft, childlike. She took the scrawl back to Kamon. His hands trembled as he held it. "These names," he said, "you're awakening them, piece by piece, one every night. That's why the village is forgetting. They're not just being remembered," she whispered. "They're replacing." He nodded slowly. "Yes, that's how the ritual sustains itself. The living must make space for the dead." She shook her head. "This isn't what I wanted." "It doesn't matter. The ritual doesn't ask. It only follows memory." That night she couldn't sleep. She lit incense, hoping to calm herself. Instead, the smoke curled toward her like fingers and traced letters in the air, backward, elegant, aching. She reached for her notebook and began writing them down, one by one, until her hands cramped, until the ink on the page began to bleed. At 3:33 a.m., her candle flickered and died, and she heard a whisper behind her. "Say my name." She turned. No one was there, but on her wall, smeared in ash, was a single word, Chakriya, a name she had never known, and yet in her throat it tasted familiar. The next morning she found her own reflection had changed, barely, subtly. Her eyes looked older. Her skin held the pallor of sleeplessness, yes, but also something deeper, like time had brushed her cheek in passing. She saw fine lines that weren't hers, and when she spoke her own name out loud, her voice cracked. Sawalak. It didn't sound right anymore, like she was borrowing it, or worse, losing it. The village grew colder. Though the sun still shone, people wore shawls and spoke in hushed tones. A fog settled every morning, even when no rain had fallen. Children walked slower, as if the air had thickened, and one by one, more names disappeared. A woman forgot her husband. A boy forgot his own face in the mirror. People stared at Sawalak with recognition and fear, like they knew she had brought something with her, or perhaps become something else. She stopped going to the market, stopped asking questions. The scroll sat on her desk, pulsing with silent heat. And every night she dreamed of the bell, not ringing, but breathing, as if it had a mouth, as if it was waiting to speak her name back to her, one letter at a time. On the seventh night, she made an offering, not because she wanted to, but because her hands moved on their own. She laid out rice, salt, a bowl of water, a sliver of her own hair. Then she knelt and whispered, "If you must use me, let it be for peace." The candle before her flared, then shrank, and in the distance the bell tolled once, followed by a child's laughter that ended in a sob. It began to call her before she even opened her eyes. The sound wasn't loud. It wasn't even sound, not exactly. It was a pull, like a thread tugging gently at the space behind her chest, a direction her soul turned toward even before her feet could follow. That morning, Sawalak rose before dawn, candle in hand, and walked into the mist-drenched woods without speaking a word. She wasn't dreaming. She wasn't sleepwalking. She was obeying. The forest welcomed her like an old friend. No branches scratched her arms, no roots tangled her steps. Even the mist seemed to clear in her path. By the time she reached the temple, the sky was still dark, but her vision had adjusted. She no longer needed the flashlight. The shadows inside the ruined structure were familiar now, comforting even. The bell stood silent, but the altar before it had changed. The offering bowl had moved. It now sat at the center of the floor, just beneath the bell, propped atop a folded cloth of deep crimson, fresh, unfaded by time. A new candle flickered beside it, though no one else was there. She stepped closer. Her body moved without command. Her hands lifted the bowl. It was heavy. Inside was a mixture of nails, teeth, hair, and ash, but not dry ash, wet, clumped, mottled with something dark and metallic. Blood. She nearly dropped it, but her fingers gripped tight, and as she stared into the offering bowl, her mind split. She saw two realities. One, herself, standing in the abandoned temple, surrounded by rot and moss. Two, a reflection, a memory not her own, of the temple as it once was. Lit by hundreds of candles, the bowl cradled in her hands as monks chanted behind her. She wore ceremonial robes, gold-trimmed, flowing. She saw her arms move, fingers sprinkling ash in a circle. She watched herself begin the ritual, but the memory ended before it finished, and she was suddenly back in her own body, trembling, breath caught in her throat. She placed the bowl gently on the altar. Her knees buckled beneath her. The bell above her trembled just slightly, as though acknowledging her presence, but it did not ring. She didn't want it to. Not yet. That night, Sawalak didn't remember returning home, but she woke to find 3 candles burned down on her table and ash beneath her fingernails. She opened her journal. 3 new names had been written inside, but not by her. She recognized the handwriting. It was her own, but the strokes were too elegant, too precise, too ancient. She read them aloud, voice barely a whisper. Manikarn, Duangjai, Sutepol. As she spoke the last name, the glass of water on her table cracked. She screamed, but there was no one to hear it. Only the distant echo of something breathing in her walls. She returned to the temple every night after that, not because she wanted to, but because not going felt worse, like skipping a heartbeat. Each time, the offering bowl changed. One night, it was filled with coins covered in mold. Another with charcoal black feathers and burned fingernails. Once with a single lotus bud, weeping red sap. Each time she lifted it, the visions returned. Each time more of the ritual unfurled within her memory, like pieces of a forgotten script being rehearsed again, line by line. She never said the chants aloud, but she mouthed them in her sleep. One morning, she lit incense in front of her mirror, just to see what would happen. She sat cross-legged and closed her eyes. When she opened them, her reflection wasn't alone. Behind her, in the mirror only, stood 7 shadowy forms, monks in tattered robes, faces indistinct, hands clasped in prayer. They stared at her, and in unison, they bowed, then vanished. The offering bowl became her obsession. She cleaned it. She kept it wrapped in cloth. She slept beside it, though it reeked of iron and mold. And every night it filled itself anew, always with something from the dead, always precise, ritualistic. It was as if the bowl had memory, and it was slowly helping her remember too, not just what had been started, but why it never had been finished. One night, she dared to ask the question aloud. What happens if the ritual completes? The forest answered, not in words, but in wind. Every tree around her groaned. The bell above her shifted on its rotting ropes. The offering bowl vibrated, and in her mind she saw it. A temple lit by fire, monks torn from their chants, a bell ringing without sound, sending cracks through the earth, and her own voice screaming names into the void, until her voice became not hers, until her name was forgotten. She collapsed to her knees. The offering bowl rolled from her hands. The bell didn't ring, but in the silence she heard something worse. Footsteps, bare, soft, coming from behind the altar, and a voice. Only 7 names left. She turned, but there was no one there, only the offering bowl, now filled with hair from her own head. The morning after the hair offering, Sawalak awoke with a strange clarity. Not peace, not calm, but a stillness that came after surrender, like a body finally giving in to an illness it could no longer fight. Her dreams had not stopped, but they no longer frightened her. The spirits no longer hid behind the veil. They stood beside her now, watching, waiting, and she was beginning to wonder if she had been theirs all along. She walked to Luang Pi Kamon's hut without shoes. The earth felt warmer than usual, pulsing beneath her feet. The sky hung low, pale, like a faded robe. Birds didn't sing, dogs didn't bark. Even the insects held their breath as she passed. Kamon was already waiting outside, seated beneath the wooden awning, a single candle burning beside him, though the sun had risen. "You look like someone who's been claimed," he said quietly. "I need the truth," Sawalak said. "I gave you the truth." "No," she said, "you gave me warnings. I want to know what happened, why the ritual was never finished, why the bell was sealed, why it still calls to me." The old monk closed his eyes. When he opened them again, they were wet with memory. "You won't like the answer. Tell me anyway." Kamon stood slowly, his joints crackling with age, and motioned her inside. His hut smelled of sandalwood and old rain. The walls were lined with scrolls, herbs and relics, bells of various sizes, cracked prayer beads, and a weathered photograph of 8 monks standing in front of the forest temple. She recognized it instantly. The temple, still whole, clean, proud. And in the corner, one of the monks looked like him. "You were there." He nodded. "I was one of the 8 who began the ritual. We were young, devout, idealistic. We thought we could do what no one else dared, give names to the nameless, light the way for the forgotten. But something went wrong. Everything went wrong," he whispered. He told her of the night the bell first rang. The temple had held dozens of unclaimed ashes, bones found in the jungle, bodies never burned properly, victims of plague and war, abandoned babies, nameless monks who had broken their vows and been denied burial. They had all been collected and placed in urns behind the altar. The monks believed that by chanting the names or creating them, they could grant these souls peace. But for the ritual to take hold, there needed to be a vessel, one among them, a monk to carry the weight of the dead and offer himself as anchor, to tether the spirits just long enough for them to find the light. But when the time came, no one stepped forward. The ritual stalled, and the bell began to ring on its own. It was not the spirits we expected. It was not gratitude that came. It was grief, endless, angry grief, like a storm made of memory, names we had no right to speak, deaths we had no right to witness. He stared at the candle, as if seeing it for the first time. 3 monks died that night. One simply stopped breathing. One walked into the fire. One laughed until he tore his own throat. And the others fled, scattered, took vows of silence. The temple was sealed, and the bell was bound with mantras of forgetting. He turned to her. "But memory is not so easily silenced, especially when you are born from its failure." Sarawak's voice dropped to a whisper. "I'm the punishment?" "You are the reminder, a thread that connects the living to the ritual left undone, a soul marked by bloodline and circumstance. You carry both guilt and potential." She swallowed. "And if I finish it?" He shook his head slowly. "You don't finish it. You become it." She left the hut in silence. The sky had darkened, though the sun was still visible. She passed a child drawing shapes in the dirt, circles, crosses, then a bell. She passed a woman hanging laundry who stared at her without blinking. She passed her own reflection in a store window, and she saw a monk's shadow standing behind her. The village was unraveling, or perhaps it had always been this way, and she was only now able to see it. That evening, she returned to her house and opened a box she hadn't touched in years. Inside were her grandmother's belongings, photographs, worn prayer beads, a funeral robe, and at the very bottom,
A letter, unopened, yellowed at the edges. She unfolded it with trembling fingers. My dearest Sawalak, if you are reading this, the bell has rung for you. I pray it didn't. I prayed every day it wouldn't. But some bloodlines are threads too long to cut. Our family once served the forest temple. We weren't priests, we were soul givers, vessels, midwives between this world and the next. Your great-uncle refused. He feared what he saw, and so the ritual split open. If it finds you, don't speak the names aloud. Don't light incense at 3:33, and never, never touch the bowl with blood in your mouth, because that's how they enter. That's how they wear your voice like skin. I'm sorry. Forgive me. Da. Sawalak sat in silence for a long time. Then she stood, walked to the mirror, and opened her mouth. Inside, her tongue was blackened at the center, like it had been burned. She hadn't eaten anything dark. She hadn't bitten it. And yet the mark pulsed, as if something had been spoken and now waited to speak again. That night the bell rang, once, then twice, then not at all, because by the time the third toll should have come, Sawalak had already begun chanting.
The chanting didn't stop at dawn. It followed her. Not aloud, not with sound, but like a current beneath her thoughts, a rhythm behind her breath. Every word she tried to speak came slower now, as if she were pulling it through water. Every thought arrived through a veil, and it took a second too long to remember why it belonged to her. She tried to greet her students that morning. Only 7 arrived. They watched her like strangers. None of them smiled. She reached for the chalk, but her fingers trembled. When she turned to write the date on the blackboard, she paused. Her hand had begun to draw polyscript, backwards, in strokes too fluid to be her own. She dropped the chalk and left the classroom without a word. Outside, the air shimmered with heat that shouldn't have existed. The trees were silent, no birds, no breeze, and yet the ground felt crowded, as if she were walking on the shoulders of the unseen. Her name, Sawalak, no longer felt like it belonged in her mouth. It tasted wrong, sharp at the edges, like it had been passed through too many tongues before reaching hers. At the market, villagers averted their eyes. At the shrine near the rice field, someone had written "Stay down" in red string and nailed it to the gate. Someone else had placed a mirror face down in the soil. A child whispered to her as she passed, "You're not walking alone anymore." She stopped going home. Instead, she walked the village at dusk, and in every window she saw her reflection standing still, even when she moved. In the pond behind the school, her shadow rippled in the wrong direction, and inside her ears she heard names she didn't recognize being whispered with her own voice. The spirits were no longer content to visit. They had begun to settle. That night, she returned to the temple. The bell didn't ring. The offering bowl was empty, but the walls had changed. Where once there had been moss-covered carvings, now there were faces, pressed into the surface like the wood had softened and allowed something beneath to push forward. Some cried, some opened mouths that never moved. One had eyes that followed her. And behind the altar, the wall bore a new word etched into the grain: host. She fled, not from fear, but from recognition, because a part of her had been waiting for that word to appear. A part of her had already known. In her sleep, she dreamed of a field of candles, thousands of them flickering in rows that stretched beyond vision. Each flame bore a name, and one by one the flames began to extinguish. As they did, the names lifted from the air and entered her chest. She tried to stop it, but her lips moved on their own. "Come home." And the flames obeyed. When she woke, she could feel them inside her. Not malevolent, not kind, just present. Dozens of presences shifting beneath her skin like memories pressing against glass. Some were children, some were old. One repeated the same word over and over in her head, downriver, downriver, downriver. Another cried softly when the sun touched her skin. Another recited a death prayer with each breath, and none of them ever stopped. She went to Kamon again, but he was already waiting. He didn't look surprised. "You have become the censer," he said. "The what?" "The smoke bearer, the body through which the spirits rise. You're no longer just Sawalak, you're becoming the bridge." She sat beside him, exhausted. "I'm losing myself." "You're not losing," he said. "You're blending." She trembled. "How many are inside me?" He closed his eyes, listened. Too many for silence. The next day, the village school was boarded shut. No warning, no explanation, just a hand-painted sign, "Class ended, go home." But the children hadn't gone home. They stood at the edge of the forest, staring into the trees. Each of them held a string of black beads in their hands, beads they hadn't had the day before. And when Sawalak approached, they spoke in unison, "We remember the bell." That night, she spoke to her reflection, not to herself, to whatever stood behind her eyes now. "I need to understand," she whispered. "Why now? Why me?" And her reflection smiled, though her lips did not move. It spoke in her voice, but an older version of it, weathered, cracked by prayer. "Because you didn't run." Later, she would find her journal pages rewritten. Every page she had filled with names was now blank, except one. A single sentence, repeated over and over. "We were banished. You brought us back." And still, the bell did not ring. It no longer needed to, because the spirits were no longer out there. They were here. And she had begun to whisper their names with reverence. The first toll came before dawn. Not a whisper this time, not distant. It rang like a heartbeat inside a coffin, slow, hollow, impossible to ignore. Sawalak opened her eyes in the dark, gasping, the sound vibrating in her spine. The bell echoed not just through the air, but through the ground, the walls, and her own breath. It didn't fade. It lingered, suspended in time, like the echo was waiting for her to respond. She sat up. The candles around her bed had all lit themselves, and the scroll, long silent, was open, pages fluttering in a wind that didn't exist. Outside, the bell rang again, then again, and again, and again, and again. By the time she reached the village square, others were awake, but no one was speaking. Doors were cracked open. Faces peeked through curtains. Some villagers knelt on their porches, hands pressed together in trembling prayer. Others walked aimlessly, whispering names that had no meaning. The bell would not stop ringing, and it wasn't just coming from the forest anymore. It was everywhere. In the rustle of the trees, in the clatter of spoons inside kitchens, in the breath of the wind. Even the crows, perched silently along the rooftops, bobbed their heads in rhythm. Toll, toll, Toll! Each chime deeper than the last, as if the bell were descending. Sawalak made her way back to the temple. She didn't remember walking there. Her feet carried her without thought. Her mouth moved on its own, lips shaping prayers without meaning, fragments of chants she had never learned but somehow knew. The path into the forest was different now, not overgrown, not hidden. It was clear, as if the forest itself had stepped aside. The air was colder, the light wrong, a grayness that did not belong to any hour of the day. When she reached the temple, the bell was still ringing, but it was no longer hanging. It floated, suspended in the air above the altar, its ropes frayed, its beams splintered, yet the bell turned on its own, slow and steady. Beneath it, the offering bowl had changed again, now filled with faces, not real ones, but masks carved crudely from wood and painted with soot. Each bore an expression of grief, mouths open, eyes wide, each one shaped with what looked like real human teeth pressed into the wood. There were 7 masks, 7 tolls still echoing, and etched in the floor beneath the bowl, in charred lines, was a single sentence. When the 7th name is spoken, the bell will choose its body. Sawalak trembled. Her mouth had already spoken 6 names. She knew this because she didn't remember them, but because the spirits inside her had grown louder. One cried softly beneath her skin. Another laughed at nothing. One hummed a lullaby through her teeth. They weren't just present now, they were active, living memories playing on loop inside her body. She turned to leave, but the door behind her was gone. The temple had no exit, only shadows, and the bell, still turning, still tolling. Back in the village, things were worse. Children no longer answered to their names. Elders began speaking in tongues no one understood, some dialects lost for centuries. A man walked into the river and never came back. A woman drew hundreds of concentric circles in the dirt until her fingers bled. And every house began to echo with a sound that wasn't quite the bell, but the memory of it. A resonance, a hum that made mirrors crack and rice spoil and fire refuse to light. The spirit of the bell had left the forest. It had come to claim its due. Kamon found her at dusk. He looked older, fragile, as if time had advanced a decade in a day. "They know," he said. "The spirits, the village, everyone. The ritual is reaching its end." "Is that why the bell won't stop ringing?" He nodded. "The final name is near. Once it's spoken, the vessel will be chosen." "Me?" "Not necessarily," Kamon whispered. "The bell will choose the one who remembered the most, the one who held the names not just in voice, but in heart." Sawalak stared into the forest. "I don't know if I'm afraid anymore." "You should be," Kamon said, "because the final toll doesn't echo outward." She looked at him. He lowered his voice. "It rings inward." That night, she dreamed of the bell, not hanging, not ringing, but feeding. The altar had become a mouth, the scroll had become a tongue, and her body had become the bell's clapper, swinging, striking, speaking. Each name a sound, each sound a door. And behind the final door, she saw herself, but not as she was. She was robed in red, skin ashen, eyes gone, and her mouth still chanting. She woke with blood on her tongue.
In her hand, clenched without knowing, was the seventh mask. And carved into the wood, in a script only the dead would understand, was a name she had never heard, but somehow already loved.
The name on the seventh mask was not hers. It should have been. She had spoken 6 names. She had carried 6 memories. She had lit 6 candles, one each night, without knowing why. But this 7th, it was different. When she traced the carved letters with her fingers, her skin burned, not from pain, from recognition, like a wound remembering the knife. She took the mask into the forest. This time, the air smelled of metal and earth, freshly opened soil, and beneath her feet, the path had changed again. It no longer led to the temple. It wound toward the banyan grove, the oldest part of the forest, where the trees were so thick and tangled they grew into each other, roots above roots, limbs fusing like bone beneath skin. The villagers never spoke of the banyan grove, not because they had forgotten, but because they had buried it. She followed the path until it vanished, then walked without it. Branches parted before her. The wind carried her name in voices not her own. And then she saw it, the clearing. At its center stood the largest banyan tree she had ever seen, ancient, twisted, alive in a way that no tree should be. Its roots wrapped the ground like fingers gripping secrets, and beneath it, half hidden beneath moss and leaf and thyme, she saw bones, dozens of them, hundreds, skulls without names, ribs curled like sleeping children, fingers still clutching faded prayer beads. They were not buried. They had been pressed into the earth, flattened, swallowed, as if the forest had been fed. She dropped to her knees. The mask in her hand pulsed with heat, then cracked, splitting down the center, the name etched across it dissolving into dust. And from the earth, the air shifted. The forest exhaled. A moan, low and long, trembled through the ground. Not wind, voices. Too many, too layered, too long silenced. And one voice, clearer than the rest, rose from beneath the tree and whispered, "We were never meant to be remembered like this." She turned, heart racing. Kaman stood at the edge of the clearing. His robes were torn and his face pale with dread. "You found it," he said. "What is this?" He stepped forward slowly. "This is the root of the ritual, the truth behind the names." "These people? They were sacrificed?" "No," Kaman said. "They were abandoned." He told her what the monks never admitted. Long ago, during war and famine, the temple had taken in the unwanted dead, those who died unnamed, unloved, unclaimed. They promised to burn them with merit, to release their spirits with peace. But the bodies came too many and too fast, and merit was scarce. So the monks made a choice. They buried them instead, beneath the banyans, hidden, forgotten. But memory is not earth. It does not stay buried, especially when the names were whispered, even once. They thought if they carved the names, if they chanted part of the rite, it would be enough. It wasn't. No. So the bell rang? Yes. To call them back? To ask why they were left. Sawalak fell silent. The air was growing colder. The bones beneath the banyan began to shift, not move, not rise, just breathe, as if memory had taken a physical form and no longer needed permission to exist. The wind whispered again, "One more name. Only one. Let it be yours." She stood. "No." The whisper turned sharp. "You invited us. You lit the incense. You carried the bowl. You opened the door. I was chosen. You remembered. Come on touched her shoulder, voice trembling. There's one way left. What? You must finish the ritual on your own terms. That's what they want. No, Come on said. That's what you must reclaim. He pointed to the scroll still clenched in her hand. Don't just chant their names. Give them your own. That night, she didn't return to the temple. She stayed in the banyan grove. She laid out candles, 7. She placed the offering bowl in the center, empty now, but still warm. She took a knife and cut her palm, letting blood drip into the bowl. Then she opened the scroll, and for the first time, she didn't read the names backwards. She read them forward, clearly, boldly, with her voice, with her soul. And when she reached the final line, she added her own name to the end. Sawalak, of no temple, of no merit, of no fear. And the bell screamed, not rang, screamed, a sound that wasn't metal, but grief. Centuries of it poured into the air like boiling oil. The trees bent, the sky cracked, the masks shattered, and the ground opened. But no spirits came forth. They left, quietly, not in wrath, but in release. And for the first time in 70 years, the banyan grove fell silent, completely, utterly, reverently silent. She collapsed, and the scroll turned to ash. She awoke with dirt in her mouth. The taste was bitter, metallic. Her body trembled with cold, though the morning sun had already risen above the trees. Her robes were damp with dew, and the scroll was gone, burned to ash. The offering bowl lay cracked beside her, its inner surface streaked with dried blood. But the silence was perfect. No wind, no bell, no whispers, just the quiet of something finished. At least that's what she wanted to believe, until she tried to speak, and the wrong voice came out. Her words were not her own. They were too deep, too slow, too layered. She said her name, Sawalak, but it echoed, fractured, like it had passed through other mouths before reaching hers. She tried again, and this time her lips moved in chant. Pali words, the ritual language, smooth and ancient. The chant poured from her throat like water down stone, uncontrolled, unstoppable. She clamped a hand over her mouth, but the words spilled through her fingers. Somewhere inside her she knew this was the final thread. She stumbled out of the banyan grove, dazed. The village had changed, not physically, not outwardly, but in the way people looked at her, with eyes wide in prayer or horror. Children hid behind walls. A man crossed himself in reverse as she passed by. The old woman who once offered her tea now held a mirror up as she walked by, her hands trembling as if checking for what followed behind her. And in her ears the chant continued, even in silence, even as her mouth stayed shut. It lived inside her now. She returned to her home to find the mirrors had cracked, all of them. Glass splintered outward as though something had struck from within the reflection. And on her walls, etched into wood, into paint, into fabric, were words she had not written. Finish the chant, or wear it forever. That night, Kamon came to her. But he didn't enter the house. He stood outside, barefoot, holding a lotus stem. I warned them years ago that a vessel would come, that the bell would choose again. She stood in the doorway, too tired to ask questions. You gave the forgotten names, you gave them peace, but the ritual was never just about them. She blinked. Then what was it? He stepped forward, eyes wet. It was about the one left behind. He told her the part she hadn't heard, the final line of the chant, never spoken, never written, the part each soul must decide alone, because in finishing the ritual, the soul giver was not freed, they were transformed. The chant became their breath, their voice no longer singular, their name no longer their own, because the bell, once it has chosen, doesn't forget, not even the one who rang it first. You're not just remembering them, Kamon said. You're becoming the memory itself. That night, Sawalak lit a single candle. She sat cross-legged before the altar she'd built with her own hands. Woven mats, 7 stones, 7 ashes, 1 broken bowl. And she whispered, "Let me carry what no one else would. Let the names end with me. Let the bell sleep." The chant began in her throat, soft, measured, then faster, louder. She felt her spine tighten, her fingers lock into mudras she had never studied. Tears streamed down her cheeks as the language overtook her, word by word, memory by memory. And then the final line. It waited, hovered on the edge of her tongue. The moment of choice, to finish or to resist. She hesitated. The candle flickered. The silence deepened. And in that pause, the bell rang once. Not outside, inside, in her chest, in her breath, in her bones, and the lines spilled forth. I am the bell. I am the chant. I am the last name. She collapsed forward. The candle went out, and all was still. Hours passed, then days. No one saw her leave the house, but the next time someone walked the road near her home, they found a small wooden plaque nailed to the door, a prayer written backwards, and beside it, carved into the wood with a blade, "The chant is broken. The bell is silent. Let her rest." But some nights, especially during ghost month, when the sky is gray and the wind doesn't move, people say if you walk by the banyan grove, you can hear her voice. Not screaming, not crying, but chanting, soft and slow, as if remembering, not for the dead, but for the living who tried to forget them. There is a silence heavier than grief, heavier than fear. It is the silence of knowing something inside you is no longer entirely yours. And that silence followed Sawalak like a shadow, even in sleep. She dreamed of a room with no walls, only a floor made of ash, and in the center, an empty bowl. Above it hung a single mask, her own face carved in wood, split down the center. A voice spoke from the mask, not loud, not cruel, but hollow. "You are not the first." When she woke, Cayman was waiting on her porch, eyes red with sleeplessness. He held an envelope. It had yellowed with time, stamped with a seal from a monastery that no longer existed. He handed it to her in silence. Inside was a single piece of paper, folded twice, brittle at the corners. It was a monk registry, a list of names from over 70 years ago, and at the bottom, signed in black ink, Anuk Sutan, senior chant keeper, ritual witness, removed by vote. Below it, he refused the final roll. The bell rejected him. Cayman spoke softly. Anuk was your great-uncle, the one your grandmother never named. Sawalak felt the air shift. A deep, familiar cold settled over her skin. She had always known there was something unspoken in her family, but not this. He was chosen? She asked. Yes. And he said no? Cayman nodded. He abandoned the rite, and the bell did what it must do. It waited, it remembered, and it watched your bloodline. She stared down at her hands. They trembled, not with fear, but recognition. All her life she had been walking a path she thought she had chosen, but the path had been waiting for her. That's why the scroll called to me. That's why the offering bowl accepted you. That's why the bell won't stop ringing, Cayman whispered. Because it was never finished. Because someone must become the soul giver. Because you were always meant to be the one who did not run. She left the house in silence, not toward the village, not toward the temple, but back to the banyan grove, where the bones had once whispered, where the roots still held the weight of forgotten names. The earth had dried now, the ground was cracked, but at the center, where the largest tree grew, the soil had parted. A hole had opened, not wide, not deep, but shaped like a body. She stood at the edge of the pit and knelt. No chants, no candles, just breath and memory. She whispered into the earth, "You were forgotten. You were betrayed, but not by me. Take my name if it gives you peace. Take my breath if it brings you light. Take my voice so the bell can sleep." And the ground responded, softly, a sound like leaves shifting. Then a single wind passed through the trees, and the bowl beside her filled itself, not with blood, not with ash, but with 7 lotus petals, each a different color, each glowing faintly. She touched one, and a name entered her, not with force, but like a memory she'd almost forgotten. Then another, then a third, until her chest was full, until her eyes filled with tears. Not sorrow, not pain, but completion. That night, the bell rang once. Then it cracked, split clean down the center, and the temple, untouched for decades, collapsed inward without sound, not in destruction, but in release. Cayman found her hours later, still kneeling, still breathing, but different, older somehow, not in face, but in presence. "Is it done?" he asked. She looked up, smiled faintly, and said, in a voice that echoed from deeper than her throat, "It is remembered." She stood, walked past him, into the forest. Her feet left no prints. Her shadow moved before her, and the banyan grove sighed for the first time in 70 years. Not in sorrow, but in relief. It began with a single flame, small, quiet, steady. Sawalak cupped her hands around the candle's base, shielding it from the windless night, though nothing in the forest stirred. The grove had grown silent again, not with tension, but with waiting. Beneath the great banyan tree she had arranged the circle, 1,000 candles. Each one sat atop a folded lotus leaf, hand-pressed with ash from the temple's ruin. No one helped her. No one saw her prepare it. She had not spoken for days, but her hands remembered the ritual, and her soul remembered the names. She lit the first candle, then the second, then the third. Each one flared to life as if ignited not by flame, but by memory. The forest watched in reverent stillness. 1,000 tiny lights flickered across the grove like souls awakening, one by one, their stories stirring in the soil beneath. She knelt before the circle and took out the final piece of the scroll, what remained of it after it had burned. Just a sliver, blank. But she didn't need words anymore. The names were inside her now. Some were clear, spoken in whispers, heard in dreams. Others emerged from silence. Some arrived in bursts of pain, others in tears she couldn't explain. But all of them belonged. All of them were waiting. She began the chant, not aloud at first, just in breath, then in hum. Then the words rose, language older than fear, older than forgiveness. And as she spoke, the candles responded. Each flame danced, each light shimmered brighter, and from the air around her, shapes began to form. Not solid, not ghosts, remembrances. A woman holding a newborn wrapped in cloth, a child with rice grains in his palm, a man with no face, only a prayer scrawled across his chest. They emerged from between the trees, from the cracks in the bark, from the roots beneath the soil. They did not cry. They did not ask. They simply stood and listened. She whispered the names, Naran, Dwanjai, Chakriya. With each, a candle extinguished, not violently, not in fear, but in peace, as if the spirit had been released, carried on the final breath of its own name. But when she reached the 800th name, her hands began to shake. The voices grew louder, not cruel, just many, a choir of memory, a sea of need. They spoke to her through her own mouth, without waiting. She could feel them burning inside her veins, pushing, climbing, reaching for the surface. She bit her tongue to stop herself. Blood filled her mouth, and still the names came. The 841st candle blew out, then the 842nd, then 10 more, 20, 50. The pace quickened, the veil thinned, and the circle of light grew smaller. Spirits stepped forward. Some reached for her. One placed a hand on her cheek. Its skin was made of light and dust. Its eyes were her own. "You remembered me," it said. She sobbed, not from sadness, but from the unbearable beauty of it. But not all the spirits moved on. Some stood still, unwilling, unable. They had names but no faces, memories but no peace. Their deaths had been too violent, their erasure too complete. They hovered at the edge of the circle, watching, waiting. And one stepped forward. It bore no mouth, but she heard its voice anyway. "You cannot light what has been drowned. You cannot name what was never born. You cannot free what still holds hatred." Sawalak trembled. The last candles flickered. Only 21 remained. She forced herself to continue, voice cracking, body weak. Her hands ached from holding the flame. The chant faltered, then resumed, then faltered again. She whispered the 991st name, then the 992nd, then stopped. She looked down. The 993rd candle sat untouched, but beneath it, the ash had shifted. It was no longer gray. It had turned black and wet, a slow seep of darkness from beneath the soil. She touched it, and it pulled her hand downward. She screamed, but no sound came out. The spirits around her vanished into vapor. the flames of the circle trembled, and from the center of the grove the earth opened, not physically, but spiritually. A rift, a tear in the space between breath and bone, and from it the last of the forgotten rose. No name, no face, only a form made of every silence ever endured. It did not walk, it drifted, and when it reached her, it placed a single hand on her heart, then pressed, hard, until she gasped and felt something exit her body, a shard of grief so deep it felt ancient. She looked up, and it nodded, not in thanks, but in acknowledgement. You remembered even us. And then it was gone. The 993rd candle flickered out. So did the 994th. One by one, the rest followed, until one remained, a single flame, the one in front of her name. She hesitated. The night was still. The spirits had gone. Only she remained, and the flame, and the final name. She leaned forward, spoke it aloud. Sawalak, and blew. Darkness. Not absence, but peace. The candle was gone. The flame, the light, the heat vanished in a single breath. But the name remained, sealed, carved now not into wood or scroll or soil, but into the air itself. Sawalak, the last name, the first memory, the soul giver. She sat in stillness, alone in the banyan grove. Ash clung to her robes. Her fingers were blackened with soot and blood. The ground around her was a mosaic of melted wax and scattered lotus petals. The offering bowl had turned to stone. Nothing stirred. Even the forest, once so thick with unseen things, now felt emptied. But inside her the chant remained. It no longer poured from her mouth. Now it pulsed with her heartbeat, soft, measured, unending. She rose slowly, limbs stiff from kneeling too long. The 1,000 flames were gone, but the glow remained, faint embers lingering like fireflies just beyond sight. She turned toward the path leading back to the temple, and for the first time in days, the bell was silent. Not broken, not dead, just listening. The temple had not collapsed as the villagers had claimed. Not yet, but it was changing. Its wooden walls groaned under invisible weight. Its carvings melted like wax, reforming into shapes that didn't belong to any faith or god. And the bell, once suspended high above the altar, now hung low, inches above the floor, waiting. Kamon stood near the entrance. His face was pale, tears dried on his cheeks. He bowed as she approached, not to honor her, but to acknowledge what she had become. The ritual is complete. The names are free, but there is one toll left. She nodded. She already knew. She entered the temple alone. The doors closed behind her, not by wind, but by will. Candles lit themselves in a slow ripple, casting golden light across the ruined floor. The offering bowl sat at the center, empty. But beside it, a new scroll had appeared, short, one line, written in her own hand. A name spoken is never forgotten. She smiled, then stepped beneath the bell. There was no ceremony, no final chant, no guiding voice, only her and the bell, and the moment they had both waited for. She reached up and gripped the worn rope with both hands. The threads were soaked in old blood and old prayers. She took a breath, closed her eyes, and pulled. The bell rang. Once. Only once. But it did not echo. It did not fade. It simply entered her. The sound filled her body like fire in a dry field. It rushed through her lungs. It shattered her thoughts. Her spine arched. Her heart stopped, then beat again, not as hers alone, but as many. The bell kept ringing, but only inside her. A private toll, a sacred call, a final memory made whole. She sank to her knees. The altar burst into flames, silent, clean, without smoke. The walls cracked and splintered, but the fire did not destroy. It purified. Everything the ritual had touched was now burning, not in pain, but in release. Outside, the villagers saw the light. They saw the fire rise into the sky like a second sun, but no heat came, only warmth and silence and peace. When Kamon entered the temple ruins at dawn, there was nothing left but ash. And in the center of it, the bell lay split in two. Its surface no longer stained, but polished clean. Resting inside one half was a single wooden mask, painted with her face, smiling. He picked it up and bowed deeply, not with sorrow, but with awe. She rang the final toll and became the silence. The forest never grew over the ruins. The banyan grove never claimed her altar. And every year during Ghost Month, the villagers gather in silence. They light a single candle and speak the names of their lost ones. One name each. No chants, no drums, just memory. And if you listen closely in the hush of night, you'll hear a faint hum from the earth, a bell that no longer rings, because it has already been answered.
Years passed, and in time, the memory of the forest temple faded from maps. The path to the banyan grove grew thinner, harder to find. No one rebuilt the altar. No one dared disturb the ash. And still, no one heard the bell ring again, because it no longer needed to. It had been answered, and it had gone to rest. The villagers never spoke of Sawalek, not directly. They referred to her only in offerings and silence. Children grew up hearing the story of the woman who remembered 1,000 names, of the teacher who became the bell, of the one who lit the candles for those no one else had mourned. They didn't say it with fear. They said it with gratitude. And then, one summer, long after the last toll had been heard, a stranger came. She was young, a new teacher, assigned by the government to serve Ban Non Sang, a village now smaller than it had ever been. She moved into the same house, the one near the trees. She swept the porch. She lit incense. She asked nothing, and the villagers said nothing. But on her first morning, she found a small object placed at her door, a folded lotus leaf. Inside,
7 grains of rice, a dried flower, and a name carved into a smooth piece of wood. Sawalak. She asked no one what it meant. But that night, she dreamed. In the dream, she walked through a forest made of mist. The trees were tall, the air still. And up ahead, she saw a figure kneeling before a circle of candles, head bowed, hands cupped around a flame. The figure turned. It was a woman, dressed in white, face calm, eyes dark and kind. She held out a single candle. "For remembering," she said, then vanished. The teacher awoke at 3:33 a.m. There was no sound, no bell, only stillness. But something in her chest felt known, like her breath belonged to someone else for just a moment, like her heart had echoed. She walked to her window and looked toward the trees. The banyan grove was barely visible in the moonlight. But just for a second, she saw it. One candle, flickering at the base of the largest tree, then gone. She never spoke of it, not once. But every year during Ghost Month, she lights a single flame and places it by her door. No chants, no words, only silence. And that is enough. Because now the bell is silent, not because it was forgotten, but because it was heard.